Hello, and welcome back to the Blush Studio. I'm Katrina Crouch, and today I'm going to walk you through my realistic watercolor tulip tutorial. To start, I'm just going to start pulling some of these colors. If you're not familiar with my palette, I have my exact palette listed down below in order. So if I forget to list a color, you'll be able to find out what it is very quickly. But I'm just mixing my yellows together, so a little bit of lemon yellow and a little bit of cadmium. But I'm also pulling in some of this purple. This is an amethyst color by Daniel Smith. But it's a purple. I'm using that to desaturate my yellow tone so that I have something to create a shadow with for my yellow tulips here in a minute. And because purple is on the opposite side of the color wheel from yellow, it's a great way to desaturate it without it getting muddy or yucky too quickly. I'm also pulling in some yellow ochre and some deep scarlet. Deep scarlet is very similar to alizarin crimson, so if you don't have the Daniel Smith color, I would go for that. Now the green that I'm going to be using is a Daniel Smith green, so I'm testing out a couple of different colors here, but if you don't have access to that or you want something similar, sap green with a little bit of lemon yellow will get you a similar hue. Now to start off, just like I do with all of my realistic watercolors, I'm doing a light wash first. So this just establishes really the value, but the underlying tone as well that I'm going to follow for the rest of the painting. So I'll kind of establish where some of the shadows are, but also avoiding some sections that will have highlights. You see I just dipped in a little bit of yellow there because I want this to be a little bit warmer, have just kind of some reflected color of what will be yellow tulips. Then I'm adding in some more of the green, and this section will be a little bit darker because it will be in shadow. And that's just what I'm doing throughout this section of the painting through this step, is I'm just establishing underlying tone and, again, a little bit of value. So I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. You'll also notice with all of my realistic watercolors, I start with a very detailed sketch. I firmly believe that the best way to improve in your watercolors, especially at the beginning, is to work on your drawing. So that is why I do not offer a copy or a print option of my drawings for those of you who aren't confident in your drawing abilities. I really think that the best way for you to improve in your painting is to work on your drawing. It helps to train your eye to see. It also helps your hand, and it really helps you to improve. And that is my goal as a teacher, is to really help you and give you the tools that you need to create fine art, to become a professional illustrator if that's what you want to do. So that's why I don't ever include really a coloring page of my drawings. I want you to be able to do it on your own. I will, however, give you the tools that you need to do that. So I do have a free mini course. If you're not very comfortable or confident in your drawing abilities, I have a free drawing course down below. It's a 5-day, it's very small, but it just goes over 5 days, and I'll have that link down below. It's called the Flower Drawing Challenge, and it has 5 of my best tips for learning to draw realistically. So anyway, I'm just putting down that first wash of color on my detailed sketch, and you'll see kind of at the where items are overlapping, I'll kind of tap in some darker color. And I'm going to do the same thing here with the petals. Now these are parrot tulips, which means that they have a lot of ruffles, but then also the petals themselves will have like individual tears. And I'm really just going to each of those ruffles or each tear in the petal, and I'm darkening it and pulling it towards the center. This not only will help me to establish overall value and show where shadows are, but it also mimics the actual growth of color on these petals. So I just find where that section is and I pull it towards the center. I'm doing this with that desaturated yellow that we created earlier, so it's very, very watered down, but my brush isn't super wet either. So it's really, there's not a whole lot on my brush. I have a little bit of pigment on there. It's the desaturated yellow that we created earlier, and then I have some water on there, but I dab it off on a paper towel or on I actually use just like a rag. So it's just a regular washcloth that's just really old, and I just dab it off on there so there's barely any pigment or any water on there, and just drag it around. So here it's a little darker. I know that I can be gutsier because it's on, not only is it on the inside of the petal, so it's a little bit brighter anyway, but it's farther back, so it's going to be in shadow. Now after I've done that to all of the petals, I'm going to go through, and while that dries, I'm going to start adding some deeper values into the shadows of the leaves. So this is kind of a second pass, if you will. A pass is just the fancy art term for the first layer of paint. So I'm just establishing more of where the shadows are, separating out, which section falls behind and which section comes forward on this leaf, and just really deepening everything up. And I'll do kind of jump back and forth between the greenery and the petals, just allowing each layer to dry completely. One of the things that a lot of beginning watercolor artists struggle with is allowing each layer to dry completely before you start adding more color. It's very, very easy to overwork a piece. So always give it time to dry. Stop earlier than you think you need to because of the transparent qualities in watercolor. It's very easy to go back and add more in. Now in some ways I'm just repeating what I did in the initial pass where I'm deepening the shadows and I'm kind of establishing where I want things to be, but my brush is more pigmented. There's a little bit more going on, but I'm still not being too heavy. If there are shadows that I want to be really dark, I can always go back in and darken them. But it's really hard to lighten watercolor, so it's a good idea to not get too dark too fast. And always, if there's something that you think you'd want to have as a highlight or even be white, definitely don't paint over that. You can always go over and paint it later, but a lot of the areas on my petals that I want to be highlights or want to show that they're higher up, I didn't paint on them at all because I want that nice white highlight to be present. Now to deepen up the green sections, I'm going to start pulling in some purple. So you'll see I have a purple section of paint down there, and I'm just slowly mixing it into the green. And I'm doing this because purple and green are what are called split complements. And that just means that they're not direct complements. So the direct complement of green is red. And if you really want to desaturate your green, red is the best answer. However, another great option is purple because it won't completely cancel out the green the way that red will. If you mix together green and red really well, you'll get a brown or even a black. But if you mix purple and green, especially if you're mixing in just a little bit of purple, the green is still very much the star of the show. However, it's darkened because purple and red are next to each other on the color wheel, and red being across from green, that makes the perfect option for kind of desaturating the green while still allowing the green to really shine. Also with purple being a little bit darker and having kind of the blue undertone, that'll help to kind of push everything back. So I love using purple as a just a way to make a shadow for greenery, but it's also perfect because of these yellow flowers. So I'm already using that color for deepening those sections either as a shadow or just to desaturate everything. And if you've been here very long at all, you know I love a limited color palette with my paintings. So being able to use that piece or that color throughout my painting to kind of help unify everything just makes me giddy. That's something that I just totally love and I think is really fun. Now one thing I'm doing here on the stems with that purple added in with the green is I'm starting to establish where the shadow is. So if you haven't already noticed, my light source for this piece is coming from the left. So my shadows are all going to be on the right side of the stem, and that will just help them to appear more and more round. And again, this is just my second pass. I'm really just going over this very lightly, trying to kind of establish certain things, but I will be adding details that will help to define everything later. Now this video is sped up a little bit just to respect your time because I'm doing a lot of repeating things, especially with the petals. I will be going back and forth, doing the same thing over 5 or 6 petals with every single flower bud. So that's why I kind of sped it up a little bit, but I think that you'll be able to get the gist of it without completely spending your whole afternoon the way I did on this painting. And here to finish off this pass, I'm just adding the purple and green to really enhance that shadow. And now let's finish those petals up, or at least get started on really more applying the color. We're doing more than just the value now. So we've got some of this yellow that we've mixed together, which again is the lemon yellow and the cadmium yellow, mostly the lemon yellow though. And I'm starting to really pull the same way that I did with the first pass. So I'm finding those little veins where the color will be, definitely focusing on where those ruffles or the tears are, and I'm pulling them towards the center of each petal. Kind of like the spine of each petal, that's what I'm going for. Now these yellow tulips have a lot of green in them. That's one of the reasons I picked them. I just loved that variation. And so I'm going through and I'm pulling and adding the green in small amounts. I don't want to overpower it or make the green the star of the show. I really want the yellow to shine. But I'm placing the green carefully, not always where it is in my reference photos, but I'm also using it to kind of enhance certain shadows as well because it's a darker color. And so if there is a shadow there, I might decide, okay, I'm going to add a little bit more of the green tone in here to help enhance that, even if it's not actually there in my reference photo. And you'll see I do that kind of on the edge of the petal itself to help kind of outline, if you will, where the petal is, where it stops and kind of where the points are. That will help it to pop a little bit while still looking realistic. So while I always say if you're going to work realistically, you need to use a reference photo, I recommend highly, highly working from life. If you aren't working from life, you're not going to know what it actually looks like. I do think that it is important as artists to know when to kind of break the rules in order to enhance the overall composition. And one of the ways I did that was kind of adding deeper colors at the points. So this point that I'm working at now, I'm going to add some green there just to help it to pop and help to define that space. Just like that. So it wasn't actually in the reference image that I was using, but it helps to show where the petal ends rather than letting it kind of fade into nothingness. And again, I'm working very lightly, not a lot of pigment, not a lot of water on my brush. There's really not a lot of anything. Sometimes I'll put a little bit down and I'll wipe off my brush, and then I'll go in and kind of blend everything out a little bit more. So there's more water than pigment on my brush, but I'm really working very light, very thin, light layers. Here's some more purple adding in with the yellow because I know that I need to add some shadows in here. And so I'm just going to go in and pop that in. I'm adding a shadow here because I really want it to recede. I want it to go back in the background. So I want to show that this petal is coming towards the viewer. So having a shadow on the inside part of the petal will really help it to pop. And here I'm just continuing that. I'm adding more shadows. I'll eventually add in some more color, but I decided I really wanted to establish where the depth was with this piece, because you can see inside this tulip, and the other ones you can't really see inside of it as much. So I needed to really get that established before I started adding more color. And it wouldn't have been the end of the world if I had added a ton of more color before doing this. I did this as the last step. But just for me to kind of help me to see and to understand what it was that I was drawing, I really felt like I needed to do that as well. Going back, adding some more pigment, and then I'm wiping off my brush here, and then kind of blending things out. And now I'm going in with the color. You can see I've already started a little bit. Now this is a little bit of the yellow ochre, and I'm pulling that towards the center. So you have a little bit on kind of where the more concentrated or the more interesting kind of ruffles or tears in the petal are. That's what I'm really focusing that color on, because I really want to show off that detail that I was very careful to draw. I don't want to lose it in my painting, so I'm going to add a little bit more concentrated color in that section. That will just help to translate to the viewer what's going on. But then I'm softening everything by taking my brush over it and pulling it towards the center. This is going to sound very repetitive. I'm really just doing the same thing. So I'm going through with our yellow color. Again, not a ton of pigment and definitely not very wet on my brush. And I'm just finding sections and I'm pulling them through to the spine, if you will, of the petal. And then I'm taking other colors, so a little bit of green, and I'm just pulling that through. And if you're having trouble visualizing this as an actual flower, I will have the reference image that I used linked down below. I arranged the flowers in a different way and really had fun with it, but just so that you can see the type of flower that I'm mimicking here, I definitely had some fun with the color and was able to do things more the way that I wanted to do it, rather than the way it necessarily appeared, but still have a very realistic look, which I thought was really fun. And here I add a little bit too much pigment, so I just wipe off my brush and pick it back up. Now the brushes that I'm using today are the Princeton Neptune round brushes. I used a size 6 for the wash, the initial first wash, but then when I started to actually add in more pigment, like now, I used a size 4, which is a little bit smaller. If memory serves me, I don't think I went down to a 2. Occasionally I will, but I tend to be more of a size 6 or size 8 girl. So the fact that I favored the 4 with this is pretty unusual. However, kind of all these details and all these little lines, the size 4 was a great way to kind of capture those without being too detail oriented. I try to avoid getting too crazy on the details and hung up on that with watercolor, because I like the fact that it's a little bit looser and there's just that freedom with it. Now here you can see I just added some deeper shadows. This is again that layer of the purple and the yellow together to help desaturate it while keeping kind of the quality and the warmth of the yellow. So deepening those shadows, showing what is inside of the flower itself, but also where the petal folds happen and kind of helping sections that fold over to kind of pop forward. And actually at this point I was worried that I had ruined the painting, but it ends up coming together in the end. But I was really worried that I had just gone too dark and too heavy-handed. So I decided to move on, and I'm doing really the same thing with the rest of the petals. You're going to see me applying the yellow tone first. I'm going to find the folds, and I'm going to pull those towards the center spine section of the petal, and I'm just going to keep doing that and layering colors. See, did a little fast forward there, and then I'm going to pull in some of the other tones. So I'm going to pull in some of that green and some of the yellow ochre just to kind of add those pops of color. I really wanted this single vein of green captured. That was very specific in my reference photo and I really loved it. So I was pulling that in and really kind of babying that section. And I'm going in very carefully. This section is sped up as well, just a little bit. It's 150% as opposed to 100%. But I'm going very carefully with each section, so I don't want to add too much color too quickly. Like I said earlier, it's easier to add color on, but if you're too fast and you're too hasty, you won't be able to fix it later. Okay, now I'm going through and I'm going to show you a little bit more of how I add different levels of the purple and the yellow in order to create my shadows. So I've done the other two flowers and now I'm just adding those shadows in to really help each of these petals to pop forward. So the petal that I'm working next to right now is above and away from the petal that I'm painting on top of. And adding the shadow in with really mostly purple is really going to help to do that. Now I'm not using a very saturated or a very wet brush at all. That's barely damp on my palette, just enough so that I'm able to move it around with my damp brush a little bit. It's really a lot like painting with a dry brush, but there's just a little bit of that moisture in there to help kind of move it around. But I moved to a more pigmented section of my palette in order to pick up a darker section. Pulling through some of those veins really help everything to pop. Really what I'm trying to do is establish depth here. So I'm darkening everything that is going to be in a shadow or behind what I'm working on in order to help translate to my viewer, which is really what art is really communicating with your viewer, showing them what you see or what you intend for them to see. Now pulling some green and some purple together, a little more green, mixing that in. So I'm going to be adding some shadows. Now since there's more purple than green, that means that it's going to be a much deeper shadow than one that would have more green in it. See how that really pops that section? And here, just adding those little pops will really help everything to move more forward, make it look a lot more realistic, and help to establish which stem is in front of which. Now when you're adding these final really deep shadows, you want to use a detail brush. So I'm going very, very slowly with this and just adding a little bit. When it's getting really dark shadows, they're not going to be your larger shadows. Those are just going to be like tiny little bite-sized shadows to really help everything to pop and to move forward. So I'm just going to like move in small sections. See how that's just kind of a tiny sliver? And then I might blend it out with some water just to kind of help the transition to be nice and soft. But I'm not working along the whole edge of the leaf like I was before, where every time I would have a pass, I would go over pretty much the whole span of that underside of the leaf. Now I'm just working on the very edges, and that will help it to pop, and it helps it to look a little bit more realistic. Now if there's a shadow below a stem, there's usually one kind of towards the top, just to help show that that is resting on top of something that is very round. So again, a little pop of a shadow, just steepening that up a little bit. I'm not going in large chunks here because we've already established where the lighter shadows are. Just fussing with this to help make it nice and crisp and look like it folds over. Now in this next section, I'm just going to add different pops of the other colors that I've pulled out. So a little bit of the yellow ochre, but a lot of that deep crimson or deep scarlet that I added. I'm just using that to kind of add some pops of visual interest. If you've been following me for a while, especially if you followed with my butterflies, you know that I like to add an unexpected color in to add some depth. It is very intentional. I'm using some color theory in here. I'm using a warm color to help warm everything up, but it's not orange, which is very close to the yellow, and it's not yellow, which is already in my composition. Instead, I'm using this red tone to kind of add a little bit of personality to the composition overall. It's very, very light. Just like we were previously using very little pigment and very little water, this is just a wash. It's really just a glaze of color to help kind of define certain areas that I want to pop. So something that I want to have emphasis, like a certain curve or a certain detail, I'm going to add that little bit of red just to kind of add some visual interest. The viewer probably won't even notice it, but it's something I did with the leaves, the stems, as well as the petals themselves. So here you can see I'm looking for a section that I really want to highlight. So this has a beautiful curve, and I want the viewer to notice it. They're not going to notice, oh, that's red, that's really weird, because it's a very light glaze, but it will add a little bit of emphasis. This is one of my favorite ways to finish off a painting. It's what I used to do with colored pencils as well, and it's just a fun way to add some interest without necessarily being distracting. And that finished off our painting. So I did go through and I deepened a couple things again, but it was really just repeating the same steps that we did before. I hope that you found this video helpful. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if there's something else that you would like to see from me in the future, whether it's a specific flower or more of a realistic painting style or even more of a looser painting style, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. And until next time, happy painting.